Great to be here. And so my background actually grew up in the shadows of ASU. Both my parents were professors there. So I used to roller skate around that campus and get chased by security guards. And so, but when we weren't on campus, we were actually out in the Superstition Mountains, kind of jumping from every little wet spot, creek, seep, or spring we could find. And then kind of had a bit of a divergence into fisheries as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal at Buddha's birthplace, followed by working on the Snake River in Washington. The gravitational pull of family brought me back to the valley, and I actually was working for Gilbert Parks and Rec when the riparian preserve went into place there. But the call of the wild kind of pulled, and so I went and joined the Nature Conservancy, Aravipa Canyon. That was followed by stints at Ramsey Canyon, Patagonia Sonata Creek Preserve, Canelo Hills Preserve, and also worked with the Malpai Borlands group. And worked with Brooke Bushman, who I saw is on the line as well, and on the San Pedro a fair bit. But I ended up here in Prescott and took this job as environmental coordinator back about 8 years ago. And that is really a catch-all for being the MS4 manager. Everything else just kind of gets thrown in other duties as assigned if it has anything slightly environmental kind of tone to it. But under the kind of program development of the MS4, we've realized that green stormwater infrastructure really does have a critical role to play. So with that, I'll see if I can. The new angle for me. Let me just get on. There we go. Are you all seeing the slideshow clean? Just the cover one here?
Yep, sure.
Yep, excellent. So today, just going to be talking about kind of the recent history of green stormwater infrastructure in Prescott, and particularly with a lean towards the future and what we've learned and where we're going. And where we're going, in large part, has been informed by many of your collective experiences shared both through this forum and just through your own daily work. So one thing we realize is that recreating the wheel is a laborious process. So if we can mimic it, it's always a much more efficient means of doing so. So in Prescott, the real origin of stormwater treatment and post-construction stormwater treatment requirements originated in our 2007 city code that calls for first flush treatment. Here it's a 1/2 inch over the impervious area. That was later augmented with our general engineering standards, and that's really where this course has its origin. And so we've had it in place for quite a while, and it's a little bit rough around the edges, as is anything that is that old with kind of an evolving science and practice. And so in Prescott, and I think this is common in many places, we have this stormwater quantity and stormwater quality considerations. Whereas stormwater quantity, we're looking at really water as a nuisance more than any kind of resource or benefit. We're trying to minimize negative flooding impacts to the city infrastructure or downstream neighbors. We're looking at pre versus post runoff. In the slightly more recent iteration of our stormwater quality perspective, we're looking strictly at that first flush. Like I said, here it's a 1/2 inch. I know at many other jurisdictions it's an inch across that impervious area, with pollution being our primary focus there. And it's often the case that these two things are reviewed or considered in isolation, and so that there isn't that opportunity for overlap and connection. And it's in that overlap where we find that green stormwater infrastructure and low impact development have a real role to play. in meeting both requirements, and beyond meeting these two requirements, also starting to look at other kind of one water components of are these sites viable as recharge sites for local aquifer recharge as well. Water, obviously, the aquifer recharge, our water use of groundwater is an issue here as it is across the state. And trying to optimize where we plant that water is really something that we haven't fully tapped into yet. One of the things that city code does allow for, thankfully, as old as it does allow for some creative solutions with regards to in lieu fee, regional detention, and other things. And so we've actually, on a limited basis, been able to explore some of those waiver options that allow a developer to meet their requirements without necessarily building something within the footprint of their project. With regards to the green stormwater component of it, there's a lot of things that have been pushing us this way. There's the EPA level type direction, but locally it's been embraced in a number of kind of definitive planning efforts and regulatory documents. And for us, it most obviously came into place with the 2012 Watershed Improvement Plan for the Granite Creek Watershed, Upper Granite Creek Watershed. One of the things that we have here is a high concentration of impaired waters. So trying to understand how we can reduce the contribution of pollutants to those creeks. We've got 12 creeks with E. coli impairments, additional impairment on Granite Creek, and 2 impaired lakes. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 impairments we're dealing with. And the Watershed Improvement Plan realized that slowing that water down, spreading it out, sinking it in, phytoremediating it all has a role to play in reducing the contribution of pollutants to those surface waters. This was reiterated in the 2015 TMDL document for both Upper Granite Creek Watershed and Watson Lake. And they both pointed at green stormwater infrastructure and the Watershed Improvement Plan as an actionable means of reducing the contribution of pollutants to those water bodies. The city's own Upper Watershed Pollution Reduction Plan looked at that as well. And while there are some caveats with regards to pollutant reductions, pass-through versus total infiltration type sites, they did see that there was a value to it, particularly where the highest concentration of pollutants occur within the city of Prescott. And then most recently, Climas did a climate profile for the Quad Cities region of here, and that Quad Cities includes places like Prescott Valley, Prescott, unincorporated Yavapai County, Chino Valley, and Paulden to a lesser degree. And so one of their primary climate adaptation strategies was the use of green stormwater infrastructure. So we see this reiterated time and time again. And the challenge for us has been, how can we realize that on the ground to realize some of the benefits that all these different documents are pointing at? And from just a purely procedural way, when we get permits in for review, whether it's a private subdivision or a commercial development, we have been, since I've been here, pointing people at low impact development guides that you see here. I see that I do need to update my Pima County one, but we do reference these in our pre-application conferences. So the first time a developer is thinking of bringing a Burger King here, or a new subdivision, or a commercial park, we are referencing that before they ever apply for a permit. So we're hopefully seeding them with the ideas of utilizing their landscaped and under the lesser desirable areas around the building envelope to incorporate some of the green stormwater infrastructure principles. And that is mimicked through the review process as well. There are other means that they can achieve those stormwater quality and first flush treatment options through, the kind of industry standards of mechanical separators, inlet filters, and those sort of things. But we've really been trying to guide as many people towards green stormwater infrastructure as possible as a means of doing both the water quality and water quantity requirement aspect. So on the private development side, it's actually in reviewing all of our sites as part of our MS4, we actually have a database inventory of all our green stormwater infrastructure sites, and they are inspected on an annual basis by myself and my teammate. And so very few of them have really gone to the quasi green stormwater infrastructure route. Most often, private development is looking for kind of more straightforward solutions that are an inlet filter that they know that their maintenance crews can deal with 2 to 3 times a year as needed. But there are other challenges that we see here when considering green stormwater infrastructure. We tend to see a lot of what's pictured here with a heavily rock mulch dominated type setting. We don't see any, wood mulch used in the basin bottoms to rebuild those soils and create those sponges that are required to really perpetuate a healthier microclimate for plants to persist. And that stems to one of the things that Ann mentioned in the introduction. It's just that the climate here is significantly different than what many of you folks are blessed to deal with, and that you have an almost year-round growing season. And so there's very minimal periods of dormancy. And so on the private side, this is about as good as it gets from the green stormwater infrastructure. There's a few exceptions, but not many. And on our the municipal side of it, we've also been challenged with it a fair amount. And so when we look at some of our green stormwater infrastructure sites, they look a little rough during certain times of the year, and dealing with pretty significant freeze-thaw issues, definite periods of dormancy, getting creative with plant palettes in a time like this for things that are part of a landscape on the private side that are going to be visible to a customer or a resident is a challenge. This is an interesting one that came online about 6 years ago. And this was one that actually had a little bit more motivation from the flood control perspective. The area downstream or behind, as these pictures are oriented, had a pretty broad floodplain. And this regional detention basin in Acker Park helped really narrow that floodway so that it pulled many people out of needing flood insurance. But this is also one of our impaired waterways. And so this was also a great sediment trap to kind of capture some of the advanced and accelerated erosion from upstream and capture it just below the riprap gabion stairs you see in that top center. Again, this is also something that came into being as part of a private subdivisions development. Tenny Ranch subdivision, which is to the south and immediately upstream of this project, they had started to install lot-sized detention basins. And they realized that they were losing out on the profit associated with that lot. And we actually had something immediately downstream of that subdivision that could serve this function. So they paid the city a certain fee, and that was put towards this project, in addition to the flood control district, some of the flood funds, as well as other city funds. So the seasonal challenges do persist, particularly, as I mentioned, in those areas where it is more visible to, say, a commercial or residential type folks. It can pay off really well. And so this basin here, it was intended to be more of an infiltration basin that really percolated it out. the soils that we encountered further down really lent this to be more of a kind of intermittent wetland, if anything. And so it retains surface water or near surface water almost the entire length of the year. And that really changed our plant palette in terms of the only thing that would survive down on the bottom are willows and cottonwoods. Landscape architect's choice here, not knowing those kind of undiscovered soil types, prevented a lot of the kind of cool plants that were intended there from really persisting. And so this is just an example of, it can look rough with our seasonal changes here, but it does have a pretty good upside. This is in the middle of downtown Prescott, really. We've had evidence of mountain lion, coyotes, mule deer, mallards actually occupy it for a good part of the spring and summer. So it's actually been a bit of a wildlife viewing opportunity as well. Some of the other sites that kind of are of a similar vein. This was a site right in one of the major intersections in town. This is a former gas station site that had monitoring wells associated with it. It was kind of just an empty no man's land, really. And it was about 6 to 7 years ago, went in and realized that it had great potential to serve as a basin. We refer to it as Taco Basin because immediately south of it is the local Taco Bell. And so that's how all of our streets maintenance crews and others know it. And so the picture on the top right is closer to the installation time. It's really become a jungle of sorts now, as evidenced by the picture in the bottom left. And one of those key points that I don't think any of us fully grasped at the time was just the maintenance requirements associated with this. So we've been watching Storm to Shade's efforts in this regard with close attention, because it's often the case that these can be the kind of no man's land where everybody kind of points at each other as to whose responsibility it is to maintain. And so we've got a drainage maintenance crew as part of the streets, and they say that it's on the park side who manages parklets, and nobody really wants to jump into these sites, and they don't necessarily have the knowledge of what maintenance of a facility, a feature like this entails. You know, what is our approach to dealing with invasive species as they show up here, whether it's the elm that's pictured in that bottom left picture just above the watershed smart icon, or other locally known invasive species. How do we deal with those? What other things are they needing to pay attention to with regards to sediment traps or other things? So that's been really kind of, as some of these older sites have matured, just the repeated message to us of figuring out how to adequately create the capacity to maintain these going forward. And from a staffing perspective, from the knowledge perspective, all of that. Because we can make a lot of these and they're quickly going to turn into kind of trash sinks with a lot of invasive species if we don't pay more attention to them. This is a site that has a lot of really cool features, and may have been a case where it was a little bit overcomplicated. And it's one of these ones that we're trying to learn from and adapt to. Again, this is a bit of a tragedy of the commons where we had this project built and then local landscape companies volunteered to kind of help with the maintenance of it, but the ground crews never understood what that entailed. And so we got kind of a lollipop, blow and go, and Zen gardening, just raking the gravel was about the extent of it. There's also design features that were here and were well intended. There's food forest components to this design at the adult center on Rosser Street in Prescott. We've got a basin in the top left picture. We've got a basin in the bottom left corner of it that actually feeds through if it overtops to the one all the way on the right-hand side. We're capturing parking lot into the front of the structure. We also have active rainwater harvesting with that cistern you see there. That was tied into the drip system. However, it was a bizarre three-way valve that probably violated some of the water pretreatment or cross-connection kind of issues that the city has requirements for. And essentially, if you didn't have the secret knowledge of with which it was installed, it became almost impossible to recreate. And as a result, many of the plants desiccated. We saw the little walkways that were underlaid with 2 to 3 inch PVC pipes just continually get blocked up. And so there's a lot of really great features to this design, and I don't want to be overly negative here, but also want to see each one of these sites as a learning opportunity to do better on our next iteration. And so we are going to be working with some local folks to kind of do some retrofits on this in the not too distant future. Look about bringing wood mulch in to kind of fill those base and bottoms, give a visual contrast, but also start building soils there. Convert those walkways into low water crossings rather than PVC underlaid crossings. And then thinking about how we deal with an active or the active cistern there in an area that has really significant and hard freezes. When are we capturing the water and when do we need to be using it? And so figuring out if that is better served as a water storage or is it better simply as a way of attenuating our irrigation during storm events, and so that that cistern is basically creating soil moisture between storms that are a week apart. We did actively monitor these sites for water quality concerns, and this one and the next one are both of the pass-through variety rather than a full infiltration. Arizona Department of Environmental Quality and Prescott Creeks also helped with some of this water quality monitoring. Our pollutants of concern are E. coli, and we did see a 50% reduction across multiple different sites using first flush samplers in PVC tubes at these sites. So there was those kind of water quality benefits we realized as well and documented. Another site, this was an ADEQ partially funded site, and it is at our rodeo grounds. And so one of the historic kind of events that we have here in Prescott are the rodeo. And so we get a lot of people coming out to it, including a lot of livestock and a lot of horses. And they are able to deposit across this field quite a bit. And so this was a water quality goal and do some phytoremediation. And again, this one did have a 50% reduction for most storm events. Once you got above the little mounds you see in that sinuous flow path there, once we overtopped those, the ability for stuff to drop out really decreased, and the E. coli kind of bounced right back up. There is a sediment forebay in the distance. Basically, it's an enlarged sediment trap that our streets crews can get in with a little skid steer, empty it, and actually weigh it or quantify it by volume on an annual basis. We did see quite a bit of recruitment here of things you would expect to find with livestock. We actually had a mesquite pop up here, which is too cold for mesquites generally here, but this one kind of freezes back every year and pops back up. Alfalfa and a few other things that would be found in feed or hay flakes have also popped up here. And again, maintenance is an issue here. We're largely dealing with the rodeo's pollutant source, but the rodeo is a private group, and the city, as the municipal group, is being held responsible for maintaining this. And so we're going to reevaluate this as the rodeo grounds grows to see if there's a more equitable way of dealing with that pollutant source. So some of our green stormwater infrastructure extended into our streets projects. We refer to them, I think it's fairly common, as whole streets projects, where we're looking at both wet and dry utilities and other components, drainage, walkability, those kind of things. This is one that came on board shortly after I arrived, and it really had the best of intentions. The challenge here is that this was an in-house design, and nobody that was designing it had any experience with rain gardens or green stormwater infrastructure. The design shows that it's close, but not quite. These upper rain gardens are great examples of what's possible. You know, we've got deer grass, desert willows, a lot of drought tolerant plants that are off of supplemental irrigation as a result of the effectiveness of these. But as you go downstream, a lot of other issues popped up. The picture on the bottom right, you can actually see there's a little bit of a metal top to the curb line there. The idea was that water would kind of dive in and back into these basins rather than utilizing gravity from the top with a more traditional curb cut. You're asking water to make almost a 90-degree turn when we've got a lot of topography here in town that really accelerates water in these settings. And so figuring out how to get that water into these places without inducing a fair amount of scour is a challenge. Now, the downside of this is that this was a project that came on board, and because of a host of other issues with it, they saw it as a bit of a boondoggle. And so the term that came into common usage at that time was to right size their streets projects. And what that usually meant, it was to scrape off any kind of green stormwater infrastructure component, minimize any kind of quality of life components, vegetation at all, pedestrian and alternative transportation considerations largely got scrapped as well. And it wasn't really the fault of this stuff, it just kind of was unfortunate to be associated with a project like this that had so many other failure points. And so we've been fighting against that for a number of years, and are just starting to kind of emerge from that. And this is one that's just a few years old, and it's a case when if you don't have experience in designing these things from the scope of the project forward, it's just not necessarily going to be a great fit. So what happened here is at the 90% kind of plan set level, when most of the hydrology and hydraulics have been calculated, they wanted to try to slap some curb cuts and other things in. And that combined with uninformed inspection created a couple of challenges here that led to a marginally functional site. And so, as you can see, we didn't have over excavation in these basins. The curb cuts are somewhat arbitrary and not necessarily capturing a significant flow from the streets. So it's better than nothing, but not by a whole lot. And there's some other on this site or this project. There were some better examples of it. I just didn't have the photos handy at the moment in terms of different corners and whatnot. So it's again a close but no cigar. And so trying to develop a more holistic approach and from a ground up approach is really the motivation behind the 604B grant that the city and West Consultants put forward and recently were awarded. And so it's glad to see Karen jump on here. We're really just kind of getting these things rolling. The goal of this project is to look at 25 candidate sites that I've kind of picked out over time. Some of them I've had in my back pocket for a while now, and evaluate them in kind of a rank weight perspective to try to get projects that are ready, essentially shovel ready. Of those 25 candidate sites, 10 of them come from, as you can see in the hash marks there, a disadvantaged area is identified by the EPA's environmental justice screening tool. And so these are some of them, but not all of them. The blue dots represent candidate sites, and the green dots represent existing constructed green stormwater infrastructure site. The red lines represent our impaired water bodies here. And so all of these things are going to come together, and the kind of deliverables we're looking at the end of this are to have 5 conceptual, basically select 5 from that evaluation to provide conceptual designs for, and then also have a table that can look at the remaining 20 sites, and we can kind of build on and have the capacity internally after the end of this grant to continually reevaluate these things and figure out, does it fall in that disadvantaged area, or will it help deal with nuisance flooding that we're experiencing close by? Will it help with a known pollutant source, commercial pollutant source, close to one of our impaired waterways? And so the idea is to get a bunch of these a little bit closer to a shovel-ready project state, and so that we can tie them into those whole streets projects, or we can do standalone projects as the capital improvement plan develops over time in the city here. And so very much in its infancy. The site selection, again, these are things, the candidate sites were ones that just being around quite a bit, doing stormwater monitoring and observation. That firsthand experience, and then also getting some training through Watershed Management Group, has been really invaluable in looking at these sites and trying to establish what potential is there. So I'm looking forward to working with Kieran and his team and moving forward on that. And just on the residential side, I did want to mention as well that the city does have a pretty long-standing and effective conservation program. About, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, they added rain gardens, and so there's actually a rebate program for rain gardens, and the city has a residential owner's manual, how-to guide on how they can incorporate that into their property. I think the motivation for that was that at that time, most folks that were just getting the little 55-gallon drums on, the corners of their house with downspouts, and that's great, but it fills up super fast, and it doesn't really extend us through the time of greatest use of the maize or the June timeframe. And so how can we effectively plant that rain to benefit local drought-tolerant plants? And so that's been great, as well as the active rainwater harvesting rebate as well. Oops. So I didn't check my time here. I think I was close. So just a couple of the key points I'll try to make here to close out. Opportunities here, getting a lot of these things shovel ready more from the ground up than being a kind of afterthought that's added on later, as it was in many of those examples I shared with you, and having some of those end requirements in mind as well, in terms of how do we make sure that this is something that is not unduly burdensome to maintain? So can we get our landscape crews in to help with the evaluation of these sites and the design components of it, so that we know what some of their limitations are or challenges with just basic maintenance? Other opportunities include the city's currently undergoing its 2025 general plan review, and so we're working towards that, and there's a lot of local interest to insert green stormwater infrastructure in here, from both those that latched onto the climate profile assessment by Climas, as well as others that are looking at just the water conservation benefits for those kind of sites. We'll also be updating our general engineering standards, and that gives us the opportunity to look at, what our first flush is, half inch versus an inch, and other considerations on what kind of features that these facilities need to have. And probably one of the things I'm really happy to see is that there really is a local regional appetite for more of these sites. The Nature Conservancy has been working with local folks to really optimize stormwater for aquifer recharge. I think there are a lot of obvious tie-ins with green stormwater infrastructure in that regard. It doesn't have to be just purely a percolation basin. It can have some other vegetative benefits for local wildlife, and that includes us. Our challenges remain local capacity. There's not a lot of folks locally that are practitioners of this, and so figuring out how we can broaden that the knowledge associated with it. We've looked at national green infrastructure certification type programs, bringing them in and offering to the local community, both private and city staff. So we're still experimenting with how to help build that capacity so that these facilities do not end up being kind of trash sinks. And then also just better understanding how we're going to deal with our topography, our soils. We just don't perk that well south of Watson Lake. And the freezing temps that really can wreak havoc on some of these features is kind of a work in progress. And so we're looking abroad to see where we can steal those great ideas and examples to use them for our own. And so with that, I'll open it up to any and all questions.